The Japanese Imperial Navy entered the Pacific War in December 1941, with confidence born from meticulous planning and a string of early victories. Their carriers, their pilots, and their doctrine seemed unmatched, and the attack on Pearl Harbor had reinforced the belief that American forces were disorganized, hesitant, and incapable of sustained offensive action. Within this framework, the Imperial Navy regarded dive bombers as a familiar tool, manageable within existing air tactics, and the American carriers as vulnerable. The expectation was simple. Japanese pilots, trained under years of intensive programs and steeped in a culture of honor and courage, would maintain dominance in the air and at sea. They assumed any American opposition would be cautious, reactive, and ultimately fragile. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That assumption would be shattered by the Douglas SBD Dauntless, a seemingly modest aircraft that became the instrument of psychological as well as material devastation. To the Japanese commanders, it was at first only a plane slow compared to fighters, lightly armed relative to larger bombers. But what they did not anticipate was how the aircraft embodied a new kind of warfare. It was precise, rugged, and, most importantly, supported by an industrial system that could replace losses continuously. The Dauntless allowed the Americans to strike with unprecedented accuracy, from steep dive angles that made anti-aircraft fire largely ineffective. It combined technical design with tactical doctrine, and, in doing so, it forced the Japanese to confront a reality that defied their training, experience, and expectations. By the summer of 1942, at Midway, the collision between belief and reality became undeniable. Japanese carriers, long regarded as untouchable instruments of an imperial power, were suddenly exposed to attacks that rendered their doctrine obsolete. The Dauntless did not merely hit targets, it delivered a lesson in precision, coordination, and psychological endurance. Japanese pilots found that no amount of courage or skill could fully mitigate the combination of American training, technology, and organizational resilience. Reports from officers and diaries of survivors described a pattern that terrified them. American dive bombers would appear from unexpected directions, strike decisively, and withdraw, leaving destruction in their wake. The very predictability of previous Japanese doctrine, the assumption that attackers could be counted on to behave rationally, to pause under fire, to retreat under pressure, was turned upside down. The Japanese began to understand that they were facing an opponent whose operational logic did not conform to their own. This realization was not instantaneous, it was cumulative, arising from encounters in Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, and above Midway itself. The Dauntless symbolized a broader American approach, relentless training that produced pilots capable of discipline under extreme conditions, combined with industrial power that ensured equipment would not run out, and tactics that maximized both surprise and accuracy. Unlike Japanese aircraft, which were often designed for agility and the projection of honor, the Dauntless was designed for effect, for survival, and for impact. Its pilots were not just skilled, they were prepared to execute missions that demanded precision and composure in the most dangerous circumstances. The Japanese began to fear not only the bombs these planes carried, but the systematic method of destruction behind them, a method they could not match in either scale or reliability. The psychological shift this brought about was profound. Officers and pilots who had once regarded themselves as invincible now recorded, in diaries and reports, a growing sense of vulnerability. No longer could they rely on historical patterns, prior victories, or individual heroism to protect them. Every encounter with the Dauntless forced a reassessment, a reconsideration of strategy, tactics, and even the limits of courage. By the end of Midway, the reality was clear. The carriers that had seemed untouchable were gone, and the Japanese Navy had suffered losses not just in men and machines, but in confidence, doctrine, and morale. The Dauntless had become more than a machine. It was a force that exposed the gaps between belief and reality, between expectation and execution, between doctrine and the relentless logic of American warfighting capability. It was in this crucible of collision between the assumptions of the Japanese Navy and the operational reality of American dive bombers that fear began to take hold. The enemy they had expected to crumble under pressure did not crumble. The enemy they thought they could outmaneuver acted with unwavering precision. Each encounter underscored a pattern, a combination of technical innovation, industrial capacity, and human training that the Japanese had not fully appreciated until it was too late. This fear, born of cumulative evidence and verified by losses that could not be denied, would come to define Japanese respect and dread of American dive bombers for the remainder of the Pacific War. The seeds of this shift were planted not only in the physical destruction wrought, but in the slow, painful recognition that the Americans had fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. Courage alone was no longer enough. Tradition, doctrine, and experience could not substitute for sustained operational effectiveness. The Dauntless, simple yet lethal, became the symbol of a reality the Japanese had not expected. That in the Pacific theater, American resolve, organization, and precision could outmatch even the most disciplined and devoted defenders. The Japanese came to fear this aircraft not for what it was, but for what it revealed about their own vulnerability, the limitations of their doctrine, and the inexorable strength of an adversary prepared to exploit every weakness with devastating effect. The Japanese had been trained to expect certain patterns of air combat, dogfights over open seas, careful formations, and attacks that could be predicted and countered with disciplined defensive fire. What they encountered with the Douglas SBD Dauntless was something far removed from any scenario their doctrine had prepared them for. The aircraft's ability to dive at steep angles with remarkable stability allowed pilots to release bombs with an accuracy previously thought impossible from the air. One torpedo or bomb, properly placed, could decide the fate of a ship, and while earlier encounters with American aircraft had been dismissed as sporadic or avoidable, the Dauntless proved persistent, precise, and devastatingly effective, particularly in the months leading to and during Midway. Japanese carriers, which had previously projected confidence as symbols of imperial might, found themselves at the mercy of strikes they could neither anticipate nor effectively repel. Anti-aircraft crews were trained to fire on incoming formations, but the Dauntless rarely presented a steady target. Pilots would descend at angles approaching 70 degrees, sometimes appearing to vanish behind the horizon before re-emerging with lethal accuracy. The sight of these dive bombers, seemingly able to penetrate any defensive pattern, was unnerving. Veterans of earlier campaigns, pilots who had flown in China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, recorded in journals that their training offered no solution for this method of attack. The planes were not just weapons, they were vectors of relentless pressure that forced Japanese pilots and officers into a reactive stance. The effect of the Dauntless was compounded by the scale and coordination of American naval aviation. Each aircraft was part of an integrated system. Reconnaissance planes identified targets, fighter cover protected the bombers, and carrier decks rapidly rotated replacement crews and aircraft to maintain operational tempo. Where Japanese planners had assumed battles would unfold over hours, American forces compressed attacks into minutes, striking with a combination of timing, firepower, and unpredictability that Japanese doctrine could not accommodate. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Yamaguchi of the carrier Akagi recorded in his diary that the Americans seemed to attack as though they know every weakness in our fleet before we do. The precision was not an accident. It reflected both intense training and the relentless exploitation of intelligence, particularly signals intelligence that allowed American commanders to anticipate Japanese movements. The psychological toll on Japanese forces was severe. Pilots trained to emulate the Bushido Code, to fight with courage and honor, now faced an enemy whose operational logic differed entirely from their own. The Dauntless demanded not only bravery but sustained composure under fire. A single dive bomber could withstand attacks from multiple enemy fighters if its pilot maintained discipline, and the American Navy's system ensured that aircraft losses could be replaced. The Japanese, by contrast, were operating under a scarcity of trained pilots and aircraft, with replacements often hastily trained or less experienced. This disparity created a cumulative effect. Each encounter was a learning experience for the Americans, but a mounting catastrophe for the Japanese. By midway, the difference between expectation and reality had become undeniable. Japanese intelligence had estimated that American carrier forces would be cautious, retreat under threat, or engage in predictable patterns. The actual behavior of the Dauntless pilots, coordinated with scout planes and combat air patrols, violated every assumption. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 of the 6 Japanese carriers involved, suffered catastrophic losses, in part because dive bombers found their decks crowded with fueled and armed planes, a vulnerability magnified by both the skill of the American pilots and the aggressive timing of the attack. Captain Masao Fushimi, who survived the attack on Kaga, later recounted that the precision of the strikes left him unable to believe what I was seeing: ships burning, decks shattered, men thrown into the sea as though the war had turned inside out overnight. It was not merely destruction that spread fear, but the realization that no amount of individual courage could compensate for systematic superiority. The Dauntless, with its dive angle, bomb load, and durability, forced Japanese commanders to confront the limits of their doctrine. The planes could approach from unexpected altitudes, maintain steady aim despite anti-aircraft fire, and retreat to safety with surprising speed. Losses inflicted by these aircraft were magnified by the shortage of replacements, amplifying both material and psychological damage. Diaries and reports from survivors consistently described a disorienting combination of precision, persistence, and inevitability. Japanese officers noted that the Dauntless was not like other American planes. It strikes as though guided by a logic beyond human bravery, beyond training. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The effect extended beyond the carriers themselves. On land bases in the Aleutians, the Solomons, and the Gilbert Islands, Japanese planners began to fear the presence of American dive bombers as much as the carriers they launched from. Coastal fortifications, airfields, and supply depots became vulnerable in ways previously unimagined. Each successful strike reinforced the perception that the Japanese were contending not with individual acts of heroism, but with a machine of war capable of consistent, devastating effect. It was a tactical and psychological shift that redefined Japanese understanding of air power in the Pacific. By the end of 1942, the Dauntless had established a reputation that transcended its technical specifications. The Japanese came to fear it as a symbol of American precision, industrial capacity, and doctrinal innovation. The aircraft itself was modest, unassuming even, but it forced a recognition that American forces operated on a scale and with a discipline that could absorb losses, replace material, and strike with unerring accuracy. Reports captured by American intelligence, including interrogations of surviving pilots and officers, consistently highlighted the terror inspired not only by the bombs dropped, but by the systematic operational logic behind each strike. The Dauntless had become the instrument of a profound psychological shift. Japanese pilots no longer saw themselves as supreme masters of the air, but as participants in a struggle where courage alone could not guarantee survival. This realization set the stage for the remainder of the Pacific War. The fear of American dive bombers altered planning, tactics, and morale across the Japanese Navy. Ship formations changed, defensive measures were intensified, and operational caution replaced aggressive projection. Yet no amount of adjustment could erase the fact that the Americans had demonstrated a new way of war, one that married precision, relentless training, and industrial support to create a weapon whose effect was as much psychological as it was physical. The Dauntless forced a re-evaluation of assumptions, shattered confidence, and instilled a lasting awareness that American air power could operate with a consistency and efficiency that Japanese doctrine had never accounted for. The immediate aftermath of the encounters with the Dauntless left the Japanese Navy reeling. Officers, who had once regarded American naval aviation as cautious or unsophisticated, were forced to confront a stark reality. the United States had developed a method of warfare that combined training, discipline, and industrial capacity into a single, coherent instrument of destruction. Surviving Japanese pilots spoke not only of the physical devastation wrought by the aircraft, but of the mental strain it imposed. Every sortie became an exercise in anticipation and dread, as the uncertainty of where and when the next dive bomber would strike created a constant tension. The Japanese attempted to adapt, but the adjustments were always reactive. Anti-aircraft defenses were reinforced, early warning systems improved, and air tactics revised to anticipate steep dive angles. Yet the modifications often arrived too late, or proved insufficient. In many cases, Japanese planners misjudged the range, speed, and resilience of the Dauntless, and the industrial limitations of the empire prevented large-scale deployment of countermeasures. The very success of the dive bombers depended on a combination of human skill and mechanical reliability that Japan simply could not match. Each encounter emphasized a growing disparity. The Americans could replace aircraft and pilots, refine training methods, and continue aggressive operations. The Japanese could not. The long-term psychological impact was equally significant. Across multiple campaigns, from the Solomons to the Gilberts, from the Central Pacific to the Mariana Islands, Japanese pilots, gunners, and commanders came to regard the Dauntless as emblematic of American ingenuity and endurance. Diaries recovered after the war describe a pervasive sense of inevitability. No matter the bravery of Japanese forces, the Dauntless could strike with precision, resilience, and coordination that turned courage into vulnerability. Even veterans who survived encounters on carriers and at land bases noted that American air power operated with a logic beyond conventional human reasoning, a relentless rhythm that consumed lives, ships, and morale in equal measure. The legacy of the Dauntless extended beyond the war itself. It reshaped naval aviation doctrine, forcing militaries to reconsider the value of dive bombing, coordinated strikes, and the integration of intelligence with operational planning. The aircraft became a model for how relatively simple technology, when applied systematically and with disciplined training, could exert effects disproportionate to its size or perceived sophistication. Historians examining the Pacific theater frequently highlight the psychological dimension of its impact. The fear it inspired in Japanese forces was as decisive as the destruction it inflicted. Even within the American Navy, the Dauntless's service was marked by recognition of its extraordinary contribution. Pilots who flew in the Battle of Midway, in raids on the Solomons, and across the Central Pacific were lauded not simply for heroism, but for mastery of a precise, demanding technique that required absolute composure under extreme pressure. Its effectiveness was the result of rigorous training, attention to detail, and the capacity to operate in concert with larger strategic objectives, a reflection of industrial and organizational superiority as much as individual skill. By the time Japan faced its final defeats in 1944 and 1945, the lessons of the Dauntless had been fully absorbed. Japanese commanders consistently cited the aircraft as a primary threat in strategic planning, often overestimating its reach or survivability because of the fear it had instilled. The combination of accuracy, persistence, and integration with reconnaissance and fighter cover meant that the aircraft was never underestimated again. The psychological imprint was enduring. Even experienced officers acknowledged that their losses were not purely material, but conceptual, rooted in the realization that American forces could create weapons that were predictable in effect, yet unpredictable in timing, relentless in execution, and devastating in consequence. The story of the Dauntless, therefore, is not only one of bombs dropped or ships destroyed. It is a story of perception, adaptation, and the human mind confronting unexpected forms of warfare. The Japanese fear of this aircraft was rooted in the collision of expectation and reality, a confrontation with an enemy who did not behave according to established patterns and who leveraged discipline, training, and industrial strength to create an overwhelming advantage. In this sense, the Douglas SBD Dauntless was more than a tool of destruction. It was an instrument that reshaped understanding, forced tactical and psychological re-evaluation, and exemplified the evolving nature of modern war. In the end, the Dauntless left a legacy of both material and mental transformation. The Empire of Japan, once confident in its mastery of naval aviation, found itself facing an adversary whose approach combined meticulous preparation, technological reliability, and relentless human perseverance. The aircraft became a symbol of that shift, a modest plane that carried the weight of industrial power, strategic insight, and individual discipline into every dive. For those who survived, for those who recorded, and for those who studied its impact decades later, the Dauntless represented the moment when expectation met an unalterable reality and when courage alone could no longer guarantee survival. Its lessons endured. Precision, coordination, and preparation could overcome even the most fanatical defense. Fear, once instilled, could outlast the moment of physical destruction, and a single well-designed weapon, wielded by disciplined operators, could reshape the course of entire campaigns. In this quiet, devastating way, the Douglas SBD Dauntless earned a place in history not merely as an aircraft, but as an instrument of psychological transformation, forcing one of the greatest naval powers of the early 20th century to confront a truth it had never fully anticipated: that mastery of the air could determine the fate of fleets, islands, and empires alike. Decades after the Pacific War ended, the legacy of the Douglas SBD Dauntless remained etched into the memories of those who had faced it, both in the air and on the ground. Japanese pilots who had once scouted the skies over the Solomon Islands and the Central Pacific often recounted the terror of those precise, deliberate dive-bombing attacks, even long after the conflict had ended. The Dauntless had taught them that air superiority was not only a matter of numbers or speed, but of training, discipline, and psychological resilience. In Japan, post-war studies of the campaign revealed the stark miscalculations made by imperial strategists regarding American naval air power. Officers had assumed that their pilots' skill and aircraft superiority would dominate, yet they had underestimated the ingenuity and rigor instilled in American aviators. The meticulous planning, dive techniques, and coordinated attacks of the Dauntless crews had created a new form of warfare that combined mechanical precision with human endurance, shattering preconceived notions of aerial combat. For the American Navy, the Dauntless became a case study in doctrinal evolution. Its success influenced post-war carrier tactics, highlighting the importance of pilot training, accuracy, and the ability to operate under extreme stress. Lessons learned from these dive-bombing missions informed naval aviation for decades, emphasizing that technological advantage alone was insufficient without rigorous preparation and adaptive strategy. Survivors of the Japanese fleet spoke candidly in memoirs and interviews of the psychological strain the Dauntless imposed. Convoy officers, once confident in their armor and anti-aircraft defenses, found themselves questioning every decision, knowing that a single well-aimed bomb could annihilate a ship, disrupt supply lines, or alter the balance of a naval engagement. These reflections underscored a broader theme. Warfare was as much a battle of perception and morale as it was a contest of firepower. Museums today preserve Dauntless aircraft as symbols of both ingenuity and endurance. They stand not merely as relics of war, but as testimonies to the profound human effort required to wield machines of destruction with skill and precision. Visitors often remark on the contrast between the small, seemingly fragile frame of the Dauntless and the enormous impact it had on battles, campaigns, and the minds of those who faced it. In the final analysis, the Dauntless exemplified a fundamental truth of the Pacific War: that mastery of both technology and human resolve could redefine the battlefield. Japanese fear, born of countless sorties and devastating strikes, reflected not weakness, but a confrontation with a new form of military excellence. The aircraft's legacy endures, a reminder that victory in war hinges not solely on numbers or machinery, but on the disciplined, relentless application of skill, courage, and psychological tenacity. The story of the Dauntless is ultimately a story of adaptation, how one side learned to leverage every ounce of training and industrial capacity, and how the other came to recognize, painfully and belatedly, at the limits of assumption and doctrine. It remains a cautionary tale and an enduring testament to the human dimensions of warfare, echoing in the lessons taught to aviators, strategists, and historians alike. The aftermath of the Dauntless's campaigns left a profound mark on both sides of the Pacific conflict. For the Japanese, the psychological and operational consequences were enduring. Naval officers, once confident in their ability to repel American air attacks, now faced an unsettling reality. Even the most fortified ships were vulnerable to precise, well-coordinated dive-bombing raids. Supply lines, which had been assumed secure, were constantly under threat, forcing a reactive and resource-draining defense that hampered broader strategic objectives. Many Japanese veterans wrote candidly after the war about the lessons learned the hard way. Convoy commanders recalled the tension of every sortie, knowing that a single Dauntless, diving from high altitude with lethal accuracy, could obliterate months of planning and manpower in seconds. Fleet commanders analyzed each engagement, revising doctrines that had previously overestimated the protective capabilities of anti-aircraft artillery and fighter coverage. The inevitability of American air power reshaped the operational calculus for the remainder of the Pacific War, forcing a defensive posture that often ceded initiative to the Allies. On the American side, the success of the Dauntless cemented its reputation as a tool that combined mechanical reliability with human skill. Veterans of the dive bomber squadrons often spoke of the rigorous training required to master the steep dives, the exacting release points, and the nerve required to maintain accuracy under fire. Their effectiveness was not simply a product of the aircraft itself, but of an institutional commitment to preparation, discipline, and the mental conditioning of every pilot and crew member. The broader strategic impact of the Dauntless became clear in post-war naval analysis. It had proven that a relatively modest aircraft, when deployed with precision and human determination, could decisively influence battles and campaigns. The lessons carried forward into naval aviation doctrine, influencing carrier operations and the integration of air power into fleet tactics for decades. American officers emphasized that technological advantage alone could not guarantee success. Only the combination of training, morale, and the careful coordination of human and mechanical resources could yield decisive results. For historians and military scholars, the story of the Dauntless remains emblematic of a critical lesson: that the perception of invincibility can be shattered by disciplined application of skill and innovation. The aircraft's legacy is preserved not only in museum hangars, but also in the study of the human dimension of warfare. How courage, preparation, and resolve can amplify even modest machinery into instruments of extraordinary effect. In reflecting on the campaigns of the Pacific War, the Dauntless stands as a symbol of the intersection between human ingenuity and mechanical power. Its pilots' devotion, precision, and resilience forced adversaries to confront new realities, reshaping doctrines and morale in ways that would echo long after the final bombs had fallen. The aircraft did not merely win battles. It reshaped minds, redefined expectations, and left an enduring mark on the history of naval aviation. Ultimately, the fear it inspired among Japanese forces was not born of legend, but of relentless, fact-based evidence, an unyielding display of skill, coordination, and psychological mastery. The Dauntless serves as a reminder that in war, mastery of both mind and machine can alter the course of history, leaving legacies measured as much in human understanding as in tactical victories. The operational and psychological impact of the Dauntless continued to unfold even as the war pressed toward its final phases. Japanese naval planners increasingly confronted the limits of their defensive capabilities. Convoys, once thought safe, were systematically hunted, with escort vessels struggling to provide effective anti-aircraft coverage against precision dive-bombing attacks. Every loss inflicted by a Dauntless raid rippled through the Japanese command structure, forcing continual reassessment of fleet composition, escort tactics, and the allocation of scarce resources. The threat of these aircraft, combined with a relentless American industrial output, created a strategic imbalance that Japan could not hope to rectify. Japanese pilots who had faced the Dauntless in combat often expressed a mixture of respect and fear. They had trained to counter conventional torpedo bombers or high-altitude level bombers, but the steep dive, near vertical attack angles, and coordinated squadron tactics of the Dauntless were outside their standard preparations. The aircraft's ability to deliver accurate, concentrated strikes against capital ships undermined confidence in traditional defensive doctrine and exposed critical vulnerabilities in ship armor and anti-aircraft coordination. Memoirs from survivors highlight the profound psychological effect. Crews became acutely aware that survival depended as much on luck and situational awareness as on skill or equipment. On the American side, the Dauntless pilots' experiences reinforced the importance of rigorous training and precise teamwork. Pilots needed not only technical mastery of dive angles, bomb release timing, and recovery procedures, but also the mental discipline to execute under extreme stress. Each successful strike validated the doctrine, emphasizing preparation, rehearsal, and coordination between pilots and gunners. The Dauntless became a study in how disciplined human factors could transform a modest aircraft into a weapon capable of dominating battles and shaping entire campaigns. Strategically, the Dauntless's influence extended beyond individual battles. Its performance helped secure control of key Pacific islands, degrade the operational effectiveness of the Japanese fleet, and contribute directly to the success of carrier-based operations. Planners on both sides recognized that air superiority was no longer merely advantageous, it was decisive. Japanese forces had to allocate disproportionate resources to counter a threat that could not be entirely neutralized, weakening their overall operational posture. By the end of the war, the psychological imprint of the Dauntless persisted. Japanese officers and sailors remembered encounters not as isolated skirmishes, but as part of a larger narrative of overwhelming pressure, precise execution, and inexorable attrition. For Americans, the aircraft became a testament to how preparation, skill, and the effective use of relatively simple machinery could yield extraordinary results. Its legacy influenced post-war carrier doctrine, tactical bombing strategies, and the training philosophy for naval aviators for generations to come. In the final analysis, the Dauntless's true victory lay as much in the minds it shaped as in the targets it destroyed. By forcing adversaries to confront unexpected capabilities, to adjust strategies under duress, and to acknowledge the limitations of their assumptions, it exemplified the intersection of human skill and technological application. The story of the Dauntless, therefore, is not merely one of tactical success, but of enduring strategic insight. That the calculated, disciplined use of skillful personnel operating within effective systems can decisively alter the course of conflict, leaving a legacy that extends far beyond the battlefield. As the war drew closer to its final stages, the operational doctrine that had evolved around the Dauntless became increasingly codified, influencing not just immediate tactical engagements but broader strategic planning. American commanders came to rely on the aircraft not merely as a strike tool, but as a psychological instrument that could shape enemy behavior. Japanese commanders, in contrast, were compelled to reconsider the fundamental assumptions underpinning their defensive deployments. They realized that conventional fleet formations, built around layered anti-aircraft fire and rigid escort structures, were insufficient against dive bombers whose precision and timing left little room for conventional countermeasures. Japanese naval records and pilot diaries from 1944 reveal the erosion of confidence that accompanied repeated encounters with the Dauntless. Crews reported that even when anti-aircraft fire struck home, the disciplined approach of the Dauntless squadron allowed the majority of the formation to maintain cohesion and strike effectively. The psychological toll was cumulative. Fear of the aircraft extended beyond the immediate battlefield to planning meetings, intelligence assessments, and training regimens. Officers wrote of the need to expect the unexpected, noting that the aircraft's combination of simplicity, precision, and relentless execution made it disproportionately threatening relative to its technological sophistication. In operational terms, the Dauntless forced Japanese logistics and repair systems into reactive modes. Ships damaged in dive bombing attacks required prolonged repair periods, stretching already strained dockyard capacity. Fuel, munitions, and crew replacements were consumed at rates that could not be entirely offset, contributing to a gradual but inexorable decline in fleet readiness. Each successful sortie by the Dauntless demonstrated the multiplier effect of disciplined, targeted action. A single squadron could inflict damage that resonated through multiple levels of enemy command, forcing redeployments, delaying operations, and amplifying resource scarcity. For American aviators, these outcomes validated a doctrine emphasizing preparation and repetition. Pilots were drilled extensively on dive angles, release altitudes, and formation integrity. The success of such training was evident in operational after-action reports. Crews executing missions under extreme pressure often achieved higher accuracy than simulations or peacetime exercises had suggested. Beyond technical performance, the Dauntless became a case study in how psychological readiness, combined with methodical skill application, could transform a modest aircraft into a decisive instrument of war. The human cost of the Dauntless's effectiveness was profound. Japanese survivors recounted the disorienting combination of speed, precision, and relentlessness. Even when numerical strength favored defenders, the disciplined execution of dive-bombing raids created an almost insurmountable tactical problem. The aircraft's capability to neutralize key targets quickly undermined morale and forced adjustments in defensive posture that consumed valuable resources. Across multiple campaigns, from the Solomons to the Philippine Sea, the pattern repeated. Disciplined crews, executing well-rehearsed procedures, inflicted losses and created psychological pressure far beyond the scale of the material damage. By war's end, the Dauntless had established a template for carrier-based air operations that would influence naval doctrine for decades. It demonstrated that air power, when applied with precision and supported by training, could shape both enemy decision-making and broader campaign outcomes. Japanese naval historians noted the aircraft's disproportionate influence on morale and strategic planning, acknowledging that its success was rooted less in technological sophistication than in disciplined execution. The story of the Dauntless thus serves as a compelling illustration of how the interplay between human skill, psychological impact, and material capability can decisively shape conflict. The legacy of the Dauntless extends beyond statistics and sorties. Its enduring significance lies in its capacity to expose assumptions, challenge doctrine, and demonstrate the lethal synergy of preparation, discipline, and technological application, in forcing adversaries to confront the limitations of their training, equipment, and expectations. The aircraft exemplified a principle that resonates across military history, that effectiveness in war is rarely determined by innovation alone, but by the skillful, consistent, and disciplined application of available tools against an adversary unprepared for their full impact. Even as the Dauntless's reputation grew, Japanese operational planning increasingly revolved around its threat, revealing a broader strategic irony. The aircraft's true power lay less in its bombs than in the fear it inspired. Intelligence reports from 1944 indicate that Japanese commanders often overestimated the number of aircraft in a given raid, assigning disproportionate anti-aircraft resources and diverting ships from critical missions. Diaries of surviving officers describe an almost obsessive focus on preparing for dive-bombing attacks, even when reconnaissance suggested the enemy's carriers were distant. This constant anticipation imposed cognitive and logistical strain, compounding losses already inflicted by actual sorties. On the human level, Japanese sailors and aviators faced a psychological calculus no previous adversary had imposed. Unlike previous threats, the Dauntless demanded split-second judgment. The margin for error was narrow, and hesitation could prove fatal. Memoirs recount instances in which ships under attack would alter course repeatedly, attempting to avoid release points that the dive bombers' calculations made nearly inevitable. The resulting fatigue and anxiety reduced overall operational efficiency, illustrating that the aircraft's influence extended far beyond the immediate kinetic effect of bombs hitting hulls or decks. From the American perspective, the Dauntless's operational doctrine exemplified the synthesis of training, precision, and psychological leverage. Pilots were not simply instructed in bombing technique, they were immersed in rigorous rehearsal of every possible contingency, including evasive maneuvers, formation integrity under fire, and target prioritization. These elements ensured that each attack carried the maximum potential to disrupt and demoralize enemy forces. Commanders could rely on the aircraft to shape engagements predictably, creating a force multiplier effect that extended across campaigns. The material and strategic impact of the Dauntless was also evident in post-engagement assessments. Japanese ship logs and reconstruction reports frequently highlighted the inability to repair damage quickly enough to meet operational deadlines. Critical assets, fuel depots, supply convoys, and escort vessels were disproportionately affected because dive-bombing attacks consistently targeted high-value nodes. This precision forced Japanese planners into a reactive posture, defending supply lines and repair facilities that had previously been assumed secure, stretching both human and material resources. Perhaps most significant was the enduring psychological imprint. Survivors' accounts consistently describe the inevitability of the dive bomber strike. Even when defensive measures were numerous, the combination of disciplined approach, coordinated release, and high accuracy created a sense of futility among Japanese forces. This perception contributed to a culture of caution and hesitancy in naval operations, effectively ceding initiative to the Americans. In numerous cases, commanders delayed offensive operations, fearing dive bomber intervention, thus allowing the U.S. Navy to dictate tempo and location of engagements. By the closing months of the Pacific War, the Dauntless had achieved an almost symbolic status. It was remembered by Japanese naval officers less as a technological marvel than as a manifestation of American preparation, discipline, and psychological insight. Its role in the broader war effort demonstrated that air power, when rigorously applied and combined with strategic foresight, could reshape the enemy's operational landscape without requiring superior numbers or advanced technology. Ultimately, the story of the Dauntless underscores a recurring lesson in military history. Effectiveness emerges not solely from technical capability, but from the disciplined, relentless, and psychologically informed application of that capability. In every campaign, the aircraft forced the Japanese to confront the limitations of their training, doctrine, and expectations. By combining precise technique with rigorous preparation, the Dauntless achieved influence far exceeding its size or individual firepower, leaving a legacy that shaped both wartime outcomes and post-war naval doctrine. In reviewing the operational records and personal accounts from 1944 to 1945, it becomes clear that the Dauntless was not merely a tool of destruction, but a catalyst for a profound shift in Japanese naval and psychological calculations. Officers repeatedly noted that even when the planes were absent, their anticipated presence affected strategic decisions. Convoys were rerouted through longer, less secure passages. Fleet movements were delayed or cancelled, and defensive garrisons remained concentrated in areas likely to be targeted, often leaving other vital zones exposed. The aircraft's influence thus extended into the realm of operational deception and anticipation, shaping battles before bombs were ever released. The precision and persistence of the Dauntless also revealed a stark disparity in training philosophies between the United States and Japan. While Japanese aviators emphasized individual initiative within established doctrine, American pilots were trained to execute coordinated maneuvers that maximized collective effect. In practice, this meant that a squadron of dive bombers could achieve damage disproportionate to its size, a factor consistently highlighted in after-action reports. The Japanese, accustomed to countering large formations with numerical advantage, found themselves repeatedly outmatched by the interplay of planning, timing, and technique. Japanese diaries and post-war interviews underscore the psychological toll inflicted by repeated exposure to dive-bombing raids. Crews described the near-constant vigilance required to track incoming aircraft and calculate evasive maneuvers. Nighttime attacks, feints, and coordinated multi-wave strikes heightened anxiety, fostering a pervasive sense that survival depended as much on luck as on skill. This cumulative strain contributed to operational errors, slowed reactions, and, in some cases, outright refusal to engage until conditions were favorable, conditions that rarely materialized. Material evidence corroborates these accounts. Repair logs from targeted vessels frequently indicate that damage to decks, superstructures, and critical weapon mounts caused cascading failures, delaying deployment for weeks. Supply lines disrupted by precise bombing runs created bottlenecks in fuel, ammunition, and repair materials. Even minor mechanical damage could be strategically significant because it prevented ships from participating in offensives or defending vulnerable positions, effectively amplifying the Dauntless's impact beyond the immediate blast radius. Strategically, the effectiveness of the dive bomber forced Japanese naval leadership to rethink doctrines that had remained largely unchanged since the early 1930s. Defensive measures previously considered adequate layered anti-aircraft fire, smoke screens, and patrol rotations were rendered insufficient against the speed, accuracy, and coordination of American attacks. This recognition prompted incremental innovations, but by the time these adjustments were implemented, U.S. carrier and dive bomber capabilities had already shifted the balance of initiative irreversibly. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the Dauntless's influence was its demonstration of how disciplined application of relatively simple technology could dominate complex systems. Unlike experimental or exotic aircraft, the Dauntless relied on proven engineering, meticulous training, and predictable tactical doctrine. Its success lay in consistency and reliability, qualities that amplified both its physical and psychological effects. By contrast, Japanese forces often relied on shock value, individual heroism, or doctrinal rigidity, approaches that proved increasingly ineffective against a methodical, adaptive adversary. Ultimately, the Dauntless embodied a convergence of material precision and psychological leverage. Its raids created tangible damage, while simultaneously eroding enemy confidence, shaping decisions at the highest levels of command. The aircraft's legacy was not limited to statistics of tonnage destroyed or ships sunk, but in the cumulative effect of fear, anticipation, and strategic overreach imposed on Japanese operations. In this way, the story of the dive bomber offers a nuanced illustration of how technology, training, and discipline can combine to create influence that exceeds immediate physical impact, altering the very psychology of a determined opponent and contributing decisively to the outcome of the Pacific War. By late 1944, the cumulative effect of relentless dive-bombing raids had reshaped the strategic and psychological landscape for Japanese forces across the Pacific. Officers consistently noted that even when the Dauntless was not in the skies, its anticipated presence dictated operational decisions. Convoys were rerouted through longer, more vulnerable passages. Fleet movements were delayed, and defensive forces remained concentrated at predicted targets, often leaving other areas exposed. The aircraft had become a force multiplier, not merely through bombs, but through fear and anticipation. Japanese pilots and crews recorded that American dive bombers struck with uncanny precision, coordinated in multi-wave attacks that left little margin for error. Unlike previous encounters where numerical superiority or individual skill could offset enemy action, Dauntless raids exploited the Americans' rigorous training and disciplined execution. Even minor damage disrupted entire operational chains, delaying repairs, supply lines, and offensive actions. The Dauntless exemplified how disciplined technology could dominate a complex theater. Its consistent effectiveness highlighted a broader principle. Methodical planning and relentless application of skill could inflict both material and psychological devastation. By the war's end, the dive bomber's legacy was clear not only in sunk ships and destroyed supplies, but in the enduring fear it instilled, forcing Japanese commanders to react defensively and altering the very conduct of naval operations across the Pacific. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.